Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Reform, Money, and Politics, the post-election outlook for American education. My name is Chris Swanson. I'm the Vice President of Editorial Projects and Education, which is better known, of course, as the nonprofit publisher of Education Week. I'm very pleased to welcome you on behalf of my colleagues at Education Week and our partners in bringing this event together. Housing starts, unemployment rates, collateralized debt obligations, leverage, quantitative easing, Main Street, Wall Street, the whole 9 yards. And I think I'm not alone. I think we're very much more attuned to those broader dynamics in education because they matter so much. Today, there's really no way to avoid it. And as we all watch and experience the drama of the Great Recession, TARP, stimulus unfold, public education really did play a prominent role in much of the public dialogue. We were hearing that a better educated citizenry and workforce was touted as being absolutely essential for rebuilding the economy, putting the nation on a firmer economic footing in a very competitive global marketplace, and really shoring up the social fabric in some very fundamental ways moving forward. Not many of us here in this room today needed convincing of that. This is things we all knew, but it was good to be hearing it from a wider audience. In more dollars and cents terms, these issues have been incredibly important. Funding for K-12 schooling, higher education, and related programs accounted for a really substantial chunk of the federal stimulus that was flowing through the American Reinvestment and American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, aka ARA, aka the stimulus. And all told, that was about $100 billion plus for education, and that doesn't count EduJobs either. So that's big money. And so nowadays, when the kinds of figures we call big money, if we look back a couple of years, there's a few more zeros attached to those than there used to be. Millions of dollars used to be a lot of money. Now it's billions and even trillions in some cases, and that's really shocking, to say the least. Some key elements of the stimulus, and here I'm talking about Race to the Top and the I3 competitions, have actually garnered a great amount of attention within the education ranks, and that's fairly obvious. But folks outside of education are starting to take note too, in particular the competitive nature of these programs, and really applying that as a strategy for broader innovation and policy development. I think people are starting to pay a lot of attention to that. These stimulus-era programs and the underlying economic circumstances that gave them birth have been instrumental, or at the very least implicated, in bringing about some really dramatic developments in K-12 education. I'm not going to name them all, but some of the greatest hits in the past couple of years. Revived and very strong movement for common standards, increased attention to teacher effectiveness, evaluation, and compensation, and I think arguably one of the strongest waves of education innovation we've seen for quite some time. In addition, these federal stimulus programs are widely seen as a blueprint for the federal education agenda moving forward, and maybe eventually, we'll get around to reauthorization of ESEA. Of course, there's also the small matter last week of the midterm elections, just a small matter. As we all know, the Republicans gained more than enough seats to take back control of the House. They narrowed the Democrats' majority in the Senate. And there were some big shifts in state houses and state legislatures across the country. And there's a new party in town, the Tea Party. So it's been a very interesting time, both for education and politics. We'll hear plenty about that today. I could go on, but I won't, so don't worry too much about that. But just suffice it to say that I think today we're confronted with some exceedingly complex issues. And these are not just complicated, they're ones of great and long-lasting consequence for American education, for our schools, for our children, for our families. And our goal today is to help delve into some of these issues, to make sense of them as best we can, and to map out some of the road ahead. As you can see from the program, you've probably already peeked at it, we've brought together a really top-flight slate of speakers, and I think they'll be able to do just that, help us to make sense of a very complicated world. Of course, I should say today's event would not have been possible without generous support from the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. The Hewlett Foundation is committed to addressing some of today's most serious social and environmental problems, and not coincidentally, it's a longtime supporter of Editorial Projects in Education and Education Week. Most recently, and apropos of today's agenda, the Foundation has underwritten a line of news coverage and investigation in Education Week that's devoted to tracking the federal stimulus and economic issues. I'm also pleased to say that the Hewlett Foundation will be supporting an upcoming program of reporting and editorial work at Education Week that will explore a number of really critical issues for education, education leadership, out-of-school time, efforts for increasing time for learning, and arts education. So I'm pleased now to turn over the podium to Matthew Kellerman, who's going to offer some words of welcome on behalf of the Hewlett Foundation. Matt supports the Foundation as an education reform and strategy consultant, and specifically works with grantees who are focused on investigating the implementation of ours education programs, like us. Matt also teaches at Stanford University, has worked in the philanthropic world, and in the trenches also at the district and state level. So it's my pleasure to have him here today. Matthew Kellerman.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here today, to be a part of welcoming everyone to this important and timely meeting. I think you'll agree that Ginny and Chris and their colleagues at EdWeek have assembled a tremendous agenda, and I, for one, am very excited to be here. Came out from California all the way for it. On behalf of the Hewlett Foundation and Program Director Barbara Chow, who sends her regrets, I want to thank EdWeek for all the important work that they do in distilling and amplifying important issues in public education. The Foundation is very proud to support their excellent journalism. And as Chris mentioned, about a year and a half ago, shortly after the passage of the federal stimulus package, the Hewlett Foundation invested about $3.5 million to support work related to implementation of the stimulus. In particular, Hewlett wanted to support the dissemination and analysis of information about the stimulus, and to help states and local school districts make good use of stimulus funds. Grants were made to nearly a dozen organizations working around the country. Now, in making these grants, Hewlett was not naive to the fiscal crisis facing states and districts. It was assumed, rightly, that most would use the bulk of federal funding to prevent teacher layoffs and restore program cuts that they had been making in response to the economic downturn. At the same time, there was a belief that small, targeted investments in good information and good resource allocation tools could leverage smarter and better use of stimulus funds. Through the collective efforts of these grantees, we've learned an enormous amount about what actually happened. As expected, most districts used stimulus dollars to address shortfalls. But some districts did use the opportunity presented by the stimulus to make changes in how they allocate funds and support reform strategies. Often these districts did so with the support of organizations like Education Resource Strategies, the Aspen Institute, or the California County Superintendents Educational Services Association. These organizations gave districts new ways of seeing their budgets and tools for making hard choices in budgeting, while keeping a clear vision on what matters most for increased student success. No one, I think, is doing this work more effectively than Karen Hawley-Miles and her team at Education Resource Strategies, so I'm really glad you'll be hearing from Karen today. And if we learned anything from these grantees, it is that the need for good resource allocation strategies will be around for some time. The dreaded fiscal cliff looms large for districts, and the budget pressures on districts are proving to be systemic and long-term. It has never been more important than now for districts to have good information about what funding strategies will have the biggest effects on boosting achievement for students. One other thing that happened over the last 2 years is that people in the education community paid attention to the stimulus. EdWeek told us that reporting on the stimulus was their most popular content over the last year or so. The New America Foundation, who we supported, saw a big spike in readership of its federal budget analyses after passage of the stimulus. So for the education community, at least, the federal reforms and the attendant funding have been a very important source for dialogue about the future of our schools. At the Hewlett Foundation, Barbara and her team obviously hope that this attention will be sustained over the next several years and beyond. The country is at an important inflection point in public education, with continued economic pressure, with new political dynamics at all levels, with many states banding together to embrace common standards for students for the first time, and with many states and districts moving from developing plans for reform to actually implementing those reforms. Hewlett recently embarked on a new funding strategy to promote deeper learning for students. Deeper learning, as we're calling it, brings together 5 key elements that work in concert: mastering core academic content, critical thinking and problem solving, effective communication, working in collaboration, and learning how to monitor and direct one's own learning. The foundation aims to increase economic opportunity and civic engagement through deeper learning, improving what students learn, how they learn it, and how they demonstrate their knowledge. The imperative for this kind of education grows day by day. So as we listen and learn together about the post-election environment and the prospect for sustaining education reform, I just want you to know that Hewlett stands ready to help in the quest to ensure better economic and civic opportunity through education for all young people. Thank you for being here and for your own contributions to that quest. Enjoy the day.
Thanks, Matt. So without any further ado, or just a little bit further ado, I'd like to call up our first panel, and while they're on the way up. This being Washington and all, politics, of course, is something of a pastime, and I'm sure last Tuesday night, more than just a few of us were glued to our television sets or radios or computers or mobile devices or what have you, or maybe a couple of those at the same time, as the returns came in. There were a few surprises, but I think it's fair to say the writing was on the wall, more or less, coming into the midterm elections, but we still had to see how it turned out, didn't we? So for Town of Political Junkies, I think our first session today is going to be quite a treat. It's a conversation with 2 of the nation's most well-known and well-respected political pollsters, Jeffrey Guerin and David Winston. When you hear the news on the radio or the television mention leading Democratic and Republican strategists, they're talking about these guys. That's who they're talking about. It just also so happens that they know the education world quite well, and so I think we're going to have some great perspective this morning. In a moment, our moderator will handle some formal introductions, but right now, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the session. When you read the program, you'll see Andrew Yarrow identified as a blogger for Education Week, and that's true. He's the author of the K-12 Parents in the Public blog, which is one of our newest. But Andy is also a journalist, a historian, a public policy consultant, and he deals with a wide variety of economic and social issues, including, of course, education. Earlier in his career, he worked for the New York Times, and he currently writes a regular column for the Baltimore Sun. And if all of that is not enough, he just published his 3rd book this week, and it's titled Measuring America, How Economic Growth Came to Define American Greatness, and you should definitely check this out. So let me turn over the stage to Andy, who's going to lead our discussion this morning.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Ginny, and I want to thank everyone at EdWeek for what should be a great discussion this morning. I don't want to do a lot of talking because we have 2 distinguished panelists who I'll be introducing in a minute, but just to say that, of course, we're here because an election happened last week. In wearing the hat of a journalist, and I like others, tend to see this election as historic. Many people have called this a watershed election. 60-seat gain for the Republicans in the House, 6 in the Senate. As a historian, though, I'm a little bit more cautious. I tell my students we shouldn't really call things historic just a week after something has happened, and or a few days, or the morning after. And I tend to look at elections. 1994 was pretty historic, 1980, 1964. Others. But I think one of the questions we'll be talking about this morning is, what will be the impacts of this election, how historic it is, how it will affect policy and politics in the months and years to come. As Chris said, we have 2 very distinguished panelists who I'm going to let do most of the talking. Jeff Guerin, the president of Peter Hart Research, one of the most distinguished pollsters, public opinion analysts, political analysts, an advisor to Democratic campaigns for many years, a commentator on the news, and David Winston, the president of the Winston Group, similarly distinguished, a commentator. I could almost say the same things about both, great things, and except more of an advisor to the Republican Party and candidates. So we should have a great point-counterpoint up here. And after talking for a bit, we'll open this up to questions from all of you. But I'd like to toss out to both Peter and David, what does this election mean? What were the voters telling us? And before we move into education policy.
Okay, I'll start. There are a couple things to sort of observe from this election. The first thing is, and the biggest outcome in terms of this election, is that independents matter. I would suggest to you that the Obama strategy in terms of focusing on the Democratic base in the last 2 weeks, in fact, created a horrible sound for independents, whereas Republicans did basically the same thing in 2006 and got an equally unsatisfying result in terms of appealing to the base of the Republican Party. In 2006, we lost independents by 18 points, and in this election, we won independents by 19 points. And that's just a huge, huge shift. So the first thing is that the political center, not necessarily the ideological center, but the political center of this country is where majorities are created and are sustained and are lost. And clearly in this case, it was both lost and won. That's the first thing. The second thing in terms of this election, and this begins to move toward specifically the issue of education, was the huge ideological shift in the electorate. In this election, 42% identified themselves as conservatives. This is from the exit polls. 42% identified themselves as conservatives, 38% as moderate. That's the first time, at least that I can remember, coming from 84 forward, rather, that there have been more conservatives than moderates in the election, in the electorate. The closest it got was 1994, when 45% of the electorate was moderate, 37% was conservative. So that's the closest it had gotten, and now it flipped. To a large degree, the reason for that was this election ended up being purely about economics, and there's a majority, a center-right majority in terms of viewing economic issues. There were elements leading to that. Clearly, the Tea Party's focus in terms of reducing spending, reducing the national debt, the concept of fiscal responsibility being their sort of primary item is going to impact in terms of funding across the board, as you're going to see most budgets be reduced, and also just given the state situation in terms of a lot of potential deficits emerging and already emerging. Again, you're going to see a lot of reduction in spending. Obviously, one of the key areas that potentially is going to impact is education. The final element, at least in terms of looking at this, and just everybody, this was not a turnout problem for the Democrats. Interestingly enough, 18 to 29 turned out exactly the same proportion as they did in 2006. Liberals turned out in the same proportion as they did in 2006. Hispanics turned out in the same proportion as they did in 2006. African Americans actually turned out slightly higher than they did in 2006. This was not a turnout dynamic. This was just an ideological shift.
Andrew might have mentioned that David and I actually do a lot of work together, particularly on education issues, so that we're not, and while our clients in politics are very different, our values as researchers are very similar. So we're going to spare you the food fight aspects of the conversation. I do have a few slight differences with David in terms of, I think there were turnout issues. But let me go back to the question, is what were the voters trying to say? And I am not a fan of trying to divine coherent messages out of an election, that, and particularly this one. America remains a very polarized country. So the people who voted for Republicans were saying something different than the people who voted for Democrats. And for me, there's a third group of the people who had voted for President Obama in 2008 and didn't vote at all this time. And so that there are different things going on with all of those groups. The small disagreement I have with David in terms of turnout is that this may have been a similar electorate to 2006 in demographic terms, but this was an electorate where there were as many McCain voters as Obama voters, so that this is not an electorate that is reflective of certainly who votes in presidential elections. So to say that here is what America is saying misses a lot. I do think, though, that elections have causes, sort of in a lot of cases knowable causes for why things happened the way they did, and we can talk more about those. And they certainly have consequences. And this election, I think, will be very consequential. One of the interesting questions is how elected officials interpret their mandates from an election. My guess is that the new Republican majority in the House and the larger Republican minority in the Senate won't be trying to interpret what the electorate as a whole was saying, but what their own voters were saying. So that the people who voted for Republicans had a pretty distinct point of view in terms of almost to a person thinking that President Obama was leading the country in the wrong direction, to a person being unhappy with the role of the federal government and wanting it to be less involved and certainly to spend less in addressing the challenges facing the country. And to the extent that the Republican majority and the Republican caucus in the Senate are responsive to those, that will be terrifically consequential in lots of respects, and as David said, with regard to education. That part of what we heard about the investments in education as part of the Recovery Act, that presupposed that there is an important federal role in K-12 education. Well, that's not necessarily a view of the world that's embraced by a lot of the Republicans who were sent to Washington, that whether in K-12 education or any other topic. And so that we may be relitigating sort of very basic things in terms of the federal role as a result of this election, in terms of the amount of resources that get devoted to education, a general, both in terms of the fiscal realities here in Washington, as well as the predisposition of Republicans to want less federal spending. That could have very particular consequences. But to me, the defining reality, David is exactly right about the importance of independence in this election, but to me, the overriding reality of this election is still about the economy, that it took place against a backdrop of 9.5, 9.6% unemployment. In fact, if we were meeting here a year ago, not right after the election, but a year before the election, and what we knew would be the case is that the election would be contested with 9.6% unemployment, where the Democrats were defending 81 districts that President Bush had won, most of those that Senator McCain had also won. I'm not sure we would have predicted an outcome totally different from the one that occurred. This isn't true at the Senate level, but at the House level, the campaigns didn't matter. People who ran good campaigns in red districts lost. People who ran bad campaigns in red districts lost on our side. And I think the composition of the electorate, that is, who didn't vote on our side, was very much driven by the economy, people's sense of disappointment that not more had happened. I'm happy to answer more questions about that. The one other demographic aspect of this election that I want to mention, because I think it has political consequences for people who care about education, is that the one demographic change in the electorate is that this electorate had a larger share of seniors, not only relative to 2008, but relative to 2006. Over the past several cycles, they have not been a good group for Democrats. In 2006, we ran even with them. In a year, we were running ahead with the country as a whole. In 2008, President Obama lost seniors by about 8 points when he was winning the country by about 6 points. And this year, I think we lost seniors by about 20 points. And one of the important David and I have spent a lot of time thinking about how do you engage the country and motivate the country to care more about education. And that bar is much higher with seniors, and I think they became more central to the political dynamic of this year.
Well, since you've both agreed, really, that this election was largely about the economy and that passions were driven, the ideological divide emerged around economic issues, that given the 9.6% unemployment, the sluggish economy, in many ways education issues took a back seat in this election. I mean, certainly I'd be interested in hearing to what extent we'll replay the debates over the federal role in education. But in terms of specific policies, as President Obama has suggested, he's hopefully hoping that there are areas for common ground between Democrats and Republicans, specifically in education policy and education reform. And I guess I would be interested in hearing from both of you both the degree to which there will be polarization and refighting, these sort of 30,000-foot fights about the role of the federal government, but also the potential for agreement around specific education reform policies.
Well, David, I think, let me just say a word about education and the campaign. I think that by and large it was not front and center in the federal races. I think that was, in some respects, a shortcoming on our side. I think there was a greater opportunity to talk about education. When you talk about all of the benefits of the educational investments in the Stimulus Act, that's nothing we ever spoke to America about. The Stimulus Act was only litigated in terms of, did it create as many jobs as it had promised? And I think we might have done well to spend more time talking about education. Certainly the amount of volume relative to how much the public cares about it was completely out of whack. Some Republicans did talk about it. There are some Republicans who were elected on a platform of still abolishing the Department of Education. I think that this question of federal role will be complicated at best in terms of trying to navigate all of this. We did a lot of work at the front end on the development of the Common Core standards, and more importantly on the promotion of the Common Core standards. And the more that Common Core standards were identified in people's minds, either with President Obama or with the federal government, and there is a nexus with Race to the Top, the more polarized it became in partisan terms. And there's you could see, fortunately, that has not really occurred in the adoption by the first 38 states. But you could certainly see the potential for that, and you can see the potential for all of this moving forward in terms of the federal argument. And there are probably some reforms upon which Democrats and Republicans can meet in the middle. But I think it will be challenging still to work those through, given all the other political problems that create gridlock in Washington, plus the that having the reforms without having the funding to implement the reforms will, I think, make them much less appealing for Democrats. And if Republicans are unwilling to provide the funding for the implementation of reforms, I think the deals will be a lot harder to strike.
Let me sort of go back in terms of where the issue of education sort of played, or what role it did or did not play. Actually, I would agree with Jeff in terms of it didn't have much of a role in terms of this election, but that's because no issue did outside of the economy. I sort of like to use this analogy, sort of if you're looking at a house and the roof's on fire, there are lots of other things that may be wrong with the house. Broken window, cracked foundation, those sort of represent health care, national debt. But ultimately, the electorate was kind of saying, why are you working on those? When are you going to put the fire out? And so to some degree, that's what this whole discussion was about. So when you ask the question, and this is from the exit polls, did the stimulus work, which ultimately became the signature item in terms of could this president deal with the economy? You had a third of the country, about a third of the country saying that it helped, a third of the country saying that it hurt, and a third of the country saying it made no difference. Among those people who said it made no difference, Republicans won by 20 points. Making no difference meant it failed. And so ultimately, going back to Jeff's point, this was an election on the 9.6% unemployment rate, and the fact that people were basically saying, and this was something that the Republicans are pushing, the question of where are the jobs. Now, having said that, one of the things that I began to see, however, in polling data was the one thing about this unemployment situation is that the length of the unemployment. That people began to realize that once people were out of work, re-entering the workforce was taking a huge amount of time, and to some degree there was a sense that that means that we have a workforce that's not really prepared for these next generation of jobs. And as a result of that, I began to see this sort of slight uptick in terms of concern about education, to the point that education, at least I've gotten my surveys, is at the same level as healthcare. And again, it had fallen off beyond that. So you basically have this one issue, economy, jobs, and then you have the second tier, healthcare, national debt, education, all being in terms of the second tier. So the one potential advantage in terms of going forward here is that in the minds of the American public, they're beginning to connect education to the economy. And that's a huge help for the issue, because it sets up within the Republican Party, and actually in terms of a national debate, this tension. So if you're dealing with the economy, does that mean that education and the quality of the workforce is a state issue? Or is that a national issue as one side of it versus the sort of traditional local control? And so I think you'll see that tension begin to emerge as people try to work through national level economic policy, of which education is a piece of, versus education as a standalone. I don't know where that goes. I'm not suggesting there are advocates. That debate is particularly clear at this point. But I think that's one you're likely to see emerge.
Okay, sure.
I very much agree with David. And in terms of Democrats and the economy, President Obama, when he was campaigning in the final few months, talked about a choice between going backward and going forward. And I think people had a sense of what backward meant, and that wasn't particularly appealing to people. But I don't think that we were successful as Democrats in telling people what forward meant. What did that look like? What was the narrative of how we're going to get from here to there? And that was a pretty important shortcoming on our side. And the other metaphor that we'd used is, they left the car in the ditch, and we got the car out of the ditch. I think people may even grant that we got the car out of the ditch, but it still felt like the car was sitting on the side of the road waiting for the junker to come, as opposed to roaring somewhere down the highway. And this is important in this context because that if we are going to be successful, and President Obama is going to be successful, and by the way, I think he will be, it will have to be because people begin to have both hope and confidence in what the future looks like, that there is a destination in sight and we've got a way to get there. And in terms of a coherent, and I don't think people are expecting miracles or expecting anything to happen instantaneously. This is all directional. are things getting better or not getting better? That is the most important political question. In fact, there was a period, I sort of digress, in May and June where people did think things were getting better. We got up to 45%. Saying that they think the economy is improving. And our prospects actually were a little bit better then. But by election day, we had fallen back down to about 30%, feeling that things are going to get better. But in any event, if we're going to have a coherent narrative about where we're going and how we get from here to there, it's hard for me to imagine how education would not be central to that. And I think part of why there is not a greater political movement around education today is that the conversation is all around means and not around ends. It's around more or less charter schools, different accountability standards for teachers. Nothing could be sort of more, unless you're in this room, nothing could be more boring to the average or less inspiring to the average American. But in terms of what kind of country we're going to be and what kind of workforce we're going to have and what are the future we want to have for our kids, what is it we're trying to achieve with all of this? I think that's how you build a political movement around education.
And if I can just tie into that, again, that's why this particular economic situation and people sort of beginning to realize the workforce isn't where it needs to be, and getting to Jeff's point, the concept of outcomes, right? The outcome is the workforce is at this point not ready. How do we change that outcome? And that's what people are focused on.
But given this emerging public awareness, which I think you're very right, of the link between the economy and education, how will Republicans and Democrats play this differently? And kind of as a subset of that, apropos of the stimulus, with the stimulus funds running out, does the Republican Party have a bit of a conundrum in that, a lot of Republican governors, most Republican governors, supported the stimulus funds for education to the states. Once we reach this funding cliff in 2011, where do you think the Republicans will go?
Let me start off with, I want to sort of continue on Jeff's analogy a little bit in terms of the keys to the car. And that is, it wasn't, yes, the country gave the keys back to the Republicans, but I would suggest to you it was the keys to a fire truck to put out the fire on the roof, okay? And so one of the things and that's why they were elected. So if you want to understand how Republicans are going to behave on the Hill and in state capitals, right, that's their command focus, right? So whenever you're talking to a Republican, understand that that's what they're thinking about. How do I get job creation going? How do I get economic growth and job creation going? And if you're not talking into that prism, they'll be interested, but it's just simply, again, it's like, okay, I've got a fire on the roof, and you're talking to me about how do I fix the window, and just understand that's the nature of that. Two, there is going to be huge pressure in terms of dealing with deficits at the national and state level, and again, what that means is when you're arguing for additional resources to be spent in an environment where everybody's trying to figure out how do we control the spending. It's a very difficult conversation. Having said that, again, the opportunity here is, given the economy, and given the concern about the economy, and given the link that people are beginning to do between education and the economy, how do you use that link? And again, going to Jeff's point, focusing on outcomes. If you start talking process, I mean, what elected officials want to be able to do is go out and tell their constituents, and here's the outcome this will generate in a way that people say, well, that's what I want.
I have a slightly less sanguine prediction about what will happen. First, I don't think that this was about giving the keys to the Republicans. I think it was more about taking the keys away or doing something different that, in fact, to the extent that people voted for checks and balances, they thought, a lot of people who did that thought that it would be a way of forcing the two parties to meet in the middle, when it will probably have the opposite effect. But look, I think that what is likely to happen is that when the money runs out, the Republicans will sort of take us over the cliff, that there's not going to be more money behind it. I personally expect, I think the chances are better than 50-50 that at some point in the coming year we'll have a government shutdown. that it's going to be bad. It's not. This is not going to be a pretty picture next year, but that I think the Republican focus on education will be much more about kind of the hot buttons, things that sort of tend to shift the emphasis away from public education in the form of neighborhood school, good neighborhood schools, and whatever the reforms are, there's not going to be the money there to support them. But I think this is going to be a very challenging period and an extremely contentious period. That there will be some talk about meeting in the middle on some of the things, but the Tea Party contingent in both the Senate and the House will make it very hard for the Republicans to embrace a robust federal role in supporting or guiding education reform in America.
But having said that, I think you'll see Republicans very much continuing support in terms of Common Core standards, reforms around teacher effectiveness. But you're right, what they're going to be looking for is ways to do that in this particular economic environment where when you're running a deficit of $1 trillion a year, you got to figure out,
Right.
You got to figure out how to manage that. And so that doesn't create the most optimal environment, but that doesn't mean that those two reforms can't go forward.
Right, but Common Core standards takes money to implement, and if it's not implemented well, we'll have the same kind of backlash to Common Core standards that we ended up having against NCLB, and so that the money's not incidental to all of this.
Oh, I'm not suggesting it's not, but I'm also just suggesting you can't spend something that's not there.
Right. All right.
Well, clearly, money is going to be the contentious issue. I'd like to open this up to the audience for some questions, either on some of the topics we've already delved into or others. Any questions for our distinguished panelists? Yes.
Good morning. Oh, thank you. Robert Mahaffey with the Rural School and Community Trust. A few weeks ago, Minority Leader Boehner, soon-to-be Speaker, gave an address at AEI. And during the address, he waxed nostalgic about his days on the Education and Workforce Committee with Congressman Miller and NCLB and the development of education policy. And he held that up as sort of a working example of how he sees the next Congress performing. Your take on that? He also said that he would empower the chairman more to lead policy forward. And I'd like to know what you think about that.
Clearly he worked quite well with Miller in terms of putting together NCLB, working with the Bush administration in terms of moving that forward. And he's also did a variety of joint ventures also with Senator Kennedy as well. And so, I mean, his approach, and given his role as having been a chair of a committee, he believes that those individuals have those responsibilities, and as Speaker, you don't just simply decide you're going to reach in and take all that away. Two, also I go back to the last time when Republicans won in terms of coming with a majority, ended up working quite well with President Clinton. In fact, we did welfare reform, cut taxes, grew the economy, balanced the budget. Unemployment ended up by the end of President Clinton's term being at 3.8%. And so he comes out of an era, bizarrely enough, in terms of Newt, that everybody assumes that was a negative dynamic. In fact, Newt and President Clinton worked quite well together, and he comes out of that environment. Having said that, this is a different election than '94 was, because, again, what the public is saying very clearly in this election is fix this economy now. And what you have, particularly on the economic side, if there's going to Jeff's point, you have a disagreement, fundamental disagreement in terms of how the economy should be run. So I don't know how that does resolve itself. And the first big vote that you're likely to get a sense for that is the first time the debt ceiling's got to be raised.
I think we will look back longingly at 1995 and 1996, even though we had a government shutdown then. It's just that our politics have gotten, exponentially more polarized since then. And with NCLB, I would say that there is a Nixon to China aspect to that. To have a Republican president be the one who sort of puts his mark on what was an important federal role in education made a difference. That, to the extent that there is a Democratic signature on it, I think that it will just sort of raise the backs of a lot of the Republicans. And now, NCLB is in some ways part of the problem now, because it's got a very, charitably put, it has a checkered reputation. And with the people who pay attention, it's less than checkered.
Yes?
Aletta Margolis with Center for Inspired Teaching here in D.C. Jeff, you made such an important point earlier, I thought, that suggested to me we may be having the wrong conversation about means rather than ends, that the conversation, is it tenure or is it not tenure, or is it merit pay, is it charters, is it traditional schools? We should be talking about what do we want young people to be able to do while they are in school and when they graduate. How do we get that conversation started?
Well, there's, through the philanthropic world and lots of other places, there's a lot of money into the conversation. I think it is, this is to me, this is really about organizing at the grassroots level as much as anything else. I don't think you can, do this kind of as a big national advertising campaign. And, but I think this is really about, trying to bring this conversation to neighborhoods all around America through sophisticated organizing. And to me, that's very important. The other thing that I would really highlight and kind of, triple stars is the importance of engaging parents in the right way, both as they obviously have a great sense of stake, and if there's not a demand among them, where's the demand pull going to come from? But also parents have to, parents are the other piece of the conversation. The role of parents isn't. There's a disconnect between how the public views that parents themselves and this other conversation is that Americans don't think we'll have better education without more parental involvement and more parental engagement and better parental engagement. And we just need to have that be a more robust part of the conversation as well.
Can I expand on one thing? There's going to be a slight transition. We've already begun to see it, and this is going to be tough for a lot of education policy people because it's been this sort of discussion among sort of opinion elites. And what you're beginning to see is this debate sort of spill out into the general public, and you've seen that in terms of what happened as a result of the LA Times article, the election here in terms of D.C., what's happening up in New York, Pittsburgh, a variety of locations where it is, in fact, a discussion with the general public at large. Part of this is, again, because the economy is beginning to play into this and concerns about that, but also I'm going to suggest that some of the education policy folks are not necessarily comfortable with that sort of interaction at this point with the general public at large, and they are going to start playing a larger and larger role, particularly as you get into these funding issues. And in terms of these funding issues, again, going to Jeff's point, it's about outcomes. And if you start saying, we need this for this process, that'll just fall into deaf ears.
And my charge to all of you in the room is to figure out how to de-jargonize your conversation.
Hear, hear.
It is your, poster children for the high use of jargon and trying to communicate with people.
We have time for one more question.
I'm confused. because everyone's going to laugh, because my name is Patty Sullivan. I work for the AFT, but I've spent 30 years working with states and governors. So I'm confused by your comments around the Common Core, and also confused by the comment that you just made about sort of what's happening locally. So, but I'll start with the first one. Governors don't like to spend a ton of money on something that they don't have to when they don't have money. And so that's, I think, why the Common Core and the common assessments are in play the way they are. Because, you know, if I can get somebody else to pay the freight, I'll go for it, and I know it's high quality. I don't think, and the new governor's seminar is going on now, I don't think these guys and women understand what they've signed up for. So we'll see if they stick with it. That's a
Which
whole
is why I
lot.
made the point is that the money has to follow the
Yeah, well, the
Common
money,
Core. Common
f-
Core without the money is not.
right, well, the money for me has to go into implementation.
Right,
And
that's what I was
curriculum,
saying.
instructional materials, support, time for teachers, all of that stuff. But I guess I'm a little confused about why, if you can save a lot of money on the upfront, why you wouldn't spend it on the back end.
How do you mean?
Well, in the sense of if you are in a place where you're not spending, I don't know, how many millions of dollars does each state spend on their assessment system every year? Millions and millions of dollars. So if you don't have to spend that because somebody else is paying for it and you're just paying for administration, why wouldn't you buy into that? And if you're getting a better set of standards than you already have, why wouldn't you stick with that?
Again, we're looking at a situation where we're $1 trillion in debt, right? And we're running, and so that's got to be addressed. It's really nice that that's where the money's coming from in terms of the U.S., the federal government running up this debt. But what's about to happen is that's got to be shut off. And if you're a governor and you don't recognize that potential, you've got a real problem. I mean, your sight is a little limited at that point if you don't recognize the fact that it's just a fiscal reality. I mean,
So if you don't have to pay for it, and the federal government isn't paying for it, and the states are paying for it at some level, but it's a coalition, so
you're going to have to figure out a new paradigm in terms of how to make it work. I mean, those are the fiscal realities. And if you're just going to assume, like, let's not worry about it and steam full ahead, and we can end up going through the same problems that Greece and Ireland's now facing, and Greece has faced. So it's sort of, and I agree, it's not a particularly pleasant alternative, but unfortunately, that's the realistic situation we find ourselves.
But that conundrum will never be solved unless you engage the voters. Unless somebody, I think to me the role model for this is Mark Warner when he was governor of Virginia. So that both K-12 and post-secondary is way underfunded in Virginia. He spent 2 years as governor trying to persuade people that he was doing everything that is humanly possible to get rid of waste and inefficiencies in government. And then he went around Virginia with a PowerPoint saying, here's the problem. We're supposed to be spending this much on K-12, we're only spending that much on K-12. We're underfunding post-secondary by this amount. In order to get from here to there, we have to redo our budget. And he put the question, that it ended up. Now, this was in good economic times, not in bad economic times. Ended up with, $1 billion more in revenue coming into the Commonwealth, that most of which went to education, and he left with sky-high approval ratings. He sort of, treated people like adults and tried to explain the problem. But I do think it was crucial that he spent 2 years first demonstrating his commitment to making government work well and efficiently. But in terms of I do think there's a certain level of we're going to have to wait the economy out. It's a reality that, even when we wait the economy out, this is still going to be a problem, and that problem will never be solved unless you have leaders sort of making the case to the public about why this really matters.
Do we have time for another question? Yes.
Jane West, from the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education. I wonder if you would comment on the teachers' unions as a political constituency and where you see, particularly moving into the next election cycle, where you see that political constituency fitting into the dialogue as it moves forward.
I think they are an important voice in certainly in the Democratic Party. A lot of people think they're a voice for ill. I think they're a voice for good. And I think they are because they, in a very genuine way, they reflect the teacher's voice. They reflect an understanding of kind of how things work and don't work on the ground. And teachers, for everything that's occurred over the past several years, are still incredibly respected in America and by Americans. And I'm more familiar with the AFT. Randy Weingarten certainly has been a force for change in ways that have been controversial within the AFT. And so, I know for sure they'll continue to be controversial. But I also know for sure that we're not really going to get the changes that we need to have in education unless they are part of the conversation as opposed to being demonized in the conversation.
Reaction. Obviously, teachers' union play a much larger role in the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. But just a couple of observations. One, public school teachers are viewed remarkably favorably. I mean, very, very well. The teachers' unions, not so well. And fortunately for teachers' unions, teachers are viewed very well. Okay. But my sense is one of the big challenges that's going to be facing the unions and is going to largely define perception is just how they handle this whole issue of teacher effectiveness. And it's going to be very critical for them as an organization, as organizations, in terms of how they manage that and how that's perceived by the public.
Any other questions, or
This has been terrific. If I could ask a question. So this was an election about the economy, right? And the upshot of that has been kind of the shift from Democrats to Republicans, right? We have divided government. How does this work out? So the economy is bad now. It's not moving very quickly. Do the Republicans have 2 years to fix this before the next election cycle comes around? And if it's not fixed, will they be held accountable, do you think, given divided government?
The answer is, in terms of accountability, yes. And again, there's a sort of a lot of moving pieces here, but if it turns out that Republicans are viewed as just simply opposing President Obama in terms of that, and that's how it's perceived, then Republicans will be gone in 2 years. If, however, there's a sense of Republicans have this potential solution and President Obama just won't let go of, in terms of where he was in his first 2 years, then I think 2012 becomes a more favorable environment for Republicans. Ultimately, and this is what's going to be slightly different about these next 2 years, and that is, it is going to be a choice between two alternatives that are being proposed, more so than we've seen. Republicans have to propose alternatives here. They don't necessarily have to get them all the way through, but it's got to be clear to the American people that there was an effort. The one element too that, and I know that the president didn't like this as an outcome, but part of what just happened was, in fact, the American public saying, yeah, maybe we do want to relitigate some of what just happened over the last 2 years. And how that's handled and how people manage that on both sides, I think will also be central in terms of where things end up in 2012.
I agree. I think the short answer is it depends. If you're a fan, if you're a fan of Kabuki, you'll have a great 2 years. And it really, it really is about how each side plays its card rather than some inevitable result if the economy is still bad in 2 years from now.
Great. I was also very heartened by Jeff's comment about Governor Warner, now Senator Warner. The world needs more PowerPoints, and that will make things better. So I was glad to hear that. So I'd like to thank Angie and, of course, Jeff and David. This is a great way to kick off the morning. Thanks.